live stream where we have virtual fireside chats. Although I ran out of time, I was going to actually get a virtual fireplace in our little chat here to put in between us and we could warm our hands up to it. But the day was too full to make that work. We wanted, Joe and I, to talk even more about the Order of Love. Actually, not so much us, but our good friend Dale Stenberg. Because when Joe and I talked about it, I can't remember if it was last week or 2 weeks before, whatever it was. We wanted Dale to be there, but he couldn't make it, or did not make it.
Hmm.
And so you had some cool things to say, especially about your school's
I
motto.
think Dale wasn't ordering his Amorises that
It's
day.
true.
Maybe
No, he
This
that's
is
didn't
why.
true.
order it at all.
That's why he didn't make it.
This
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
true. Matter of fact, I fail all the time at ordoing the Amoris. Yeah.
Mm.
So I told Joe after you guys got done recording, I was like, I would love to like do another one
Mm.
because so at the school that I started, our our motto is Ordinance Amoris, ordering the affections. And, you know, when I introduce parents to our program, it's one of the three things I talk about. I talk about our values, our vision, and our motto. And I always leave the motto for the last because it's the most potent rhetorically, but it also captures what the entire program that we're trying to the entire mission that we're trying to accomplish, it captures it philosophically
Mm.
and theologically. But anyway, I had a teacher come up to me and after all the chatter on Twitter, and she said, "Hey, I didn't know our motto was racist." And,
Mm.
you know, I chuckled and she was kind of saying it tongue in cheek. And we sat down and we had a really good discussion about our motto, ordering the affections. And you two covered a lot of this, and you know, many people are saying lots of things, but one thing I think I can contribute is
They are.
I almost never talk about the ordering of the affections relative to relationship to nature and, or I'm sorry, neighbor and family. Because in the context of education, it plays the role that it plays most is like helping us to properly not only like rank our loves in terms of like God at the top and then things underneath of that, uh, but how to train our mind to see the good, the true, and the beautiful anywhere you look. Whether that be in nature, whether that be in food, wine, whatever. Like all of reality is imprinted with God, God's nature to some extent, in the same way that Paul will talk about that in Romans chapter 1. We can clearly perceive the nature of God, his power and divine Godhead, and the things that have been made. And it's like, duh, because God made it. And so, since that's true, then we can find good, true, and beautiful things everywhere. Here's how I try to talk to my parents about it. If so my family loves food. Before we started recording, I told the boys I'm cooking up some gumbo. I've been cooking for the last 4 hours. It's Valentine's, so I'm making the wife a treat tonight. And we've always been like that. We've always loved good coffee, good food, good wine, good times. And when my son was young, he's 17 now, and we would go out to nice restaurants, he would just always order chicken fingers and French fries. That's just it didn't matter. You could be at Ruth's Chris Steakhouse and he's going to get chicken fingers and French fries. And as he matured and grew, we would introduce new ingredients and recipes and food profile, you know, flavor profiles and textures to him, and then talk about what we were giving him and why we thought it was good and some of the things that his palate should be picking up. And now Dale at 17, I think, has a very, very sophisticated palate. He likes a very diverse range of foods. He knows what he likes. He knows what he doesn't like, but he knows what he's looking for in a recipe. And that's kind of how the mind works with ideas. The mind, you can think about it like the palate of the mind is hungry for ideas. And what our job as educators at Pietas is to introduce the mind to the best ideas available and then point at things in those ideas on what makes them so great and what makes them lovely and pure and honorable and noble. And if you do this, the mind begins to create habits such that it doesn't need you to point things out anymore. So it kind of just has a sense of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and can appreciate it wherever it's found. And that's what we call ordering the affections. So we're kind of creating habits of mind that instinctively, without coercion, arrive at an appreciation for the good, the true, and the beautiful in poetry or literature or music and movies or food or just reality. And so that's kind of where I think that side of the ordering of affections is just not being discussed.
Yeah, what's interesting about the way that you speak about that is that it's almost like it's just a proper posture of yourself before whatever reality is in front of you.
Yeah.
What would it mean to value this good glass of wine too much, too little, rightly, wrongly, and rightly relative to other things? That sort of thing. And that quote Wyatt brought out from Augustine that you introduced our last Ordo Amoris discussion with. It's interesting because what Dale is saying and what's in that quote in Augustine is kind of that piece of the conversation I don't hear in a lot of the contemporary dialogue. Augustine sounds a lot more like what you're saying, Dale, which is almost like this set of, it's not an algorithm as such. You don't want to think of it that way, but there's this sense that I'm postured before good created realities. It is my soul rightly evaluating how much I should take goodness from this, or am I giving it in an idolatrous, weightedness relative to the whole of things? And the way that applies it, in a lot of the recent discussions, the problem is like it takes an enormous amount of wisdom to make judgments about that. So, for instance, if we were talking even about all the vertical dimensions of, love of neighbor and that sort of thing, and what's Ordo Amoris there, it's really an act of judgment. Like, just as you could value your far away neighbor too much relative to who you should be more valuing your immediate neighbor, say, something like that. You could also undervalue your far away neighbor. And it really takes the act of wisdom and righteousness. It takes a righteous soul, in a sense, to really make the precise evaluation about where that line is. And I think what we see here is I talk about my students, or talk to my not about my students. I talk to my students about this, and it's very often misunderstood that in Aristotle, when he's talking about sort of the golden mean between the virtues, there's this sense that, well, if you just go aim in between the two possible ways to fall off, you'll discover virtue. And in fact, neither Aristotle, as at least Stephen R. L. Clark explains him, or the Bible speak this way. Virtue, the precision of virtue is not found between the two things. Most of what's going on in the golden mean is sort of like, take the virtue of courage. Either to kind of fall short of courage is cowardice, to be quote quote too courageous is to be reckless, and really none of them have courage at all. They're not actually too short of courage or too much courage. They're just things that kind of look like courage, or one is a parody of courage and one is just a lack of courage. You might put it that way. So most of us fall off on one side of those things in any given circumstance. Either maybe I tend to not act when I should act, or I tend to overact when I should hold back from action, something like that. But that's really just to slightly adjust for your problematic tendencies. What is it like to actually discover the precision in an area like this, the ordering of the loves? Well, it's actually to see the exemplar. Both Aristotle and the Bible, interestingly, recognize that where you actually find righteousness is in the concrete exemplar that gets the bullseye. And of course, for Christians, and I think this is more or less an objective historical reality at this point, the concrete historical exemplar, of course, is the person of Christ. And this is where the moral, even though we have all these dimensions of the atonement, we shouldn't understate the healing power of the kind of the greatness of that concrete moral exemplar, and relative to all of his acts, the effect of that in the world.
Yeah.
Well, I do think that Augustine quotation, I don't know how it presents if you're streaming or whatever, but I put it in the chat here. When I encountered it, whatever it was 10 years ago, it was actually one of those things that stayed with me for a very long time. Because similar to what Dale was saying, maybe Augustine actually was reading Dale and then wrote it afterwards. I'm not sure.
Transtemporality,
Yeah.
I just love the idea that a person who lives a just and holy life is someone basically who loves well. And he says this person is a person who has ordered his love. That's the Ordo Amoris kind of idea. So that he does not love what is wrong to love. Namely, that I don't love a woman who's not my wife, in that way. So that he does not love what is wrong to love, or fail to love what she should love. So if there's someone who needs help, there's a Samaritan, whatever, a Jewish person in the world, and I'm a Samaritan, I should be the good neighbor and go help them, instead of just walking by. Or love too much what should be loved less. You could think of like alcohol or something. Or love too little what should be loved more. You could think about church attendance or something like that. Or love two things equally if one of them should be loved either less or more than the other. Maybe, someone at work versus your wife. Or love things either more or less if they should be loved equally. It's just interesting to me, like he's going through his list, and what he's saying is the baseline of a just and holy life is a well-ordered love. And his goal isn't to minimize love or to exclude people in love, but to order love according to the proportion of the thing loved.
Yes.
So it's obvious if I say I love pizza, there's a truth there. But if I say I love you to my son, everyone knows that the love for pizza is less than the love for my son, but they're both appropriate. If I love pizza more than my son, it would be strange. I don't know. It would be a disordered
Sinful.
love. Sinful.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, I talked with Stephen Wedgeworth about this yesterday, the day before, I can't remember. We did this thing because Pope Francis wrote a letter to the bishops of the United States on the Ordo Amoris. We talked about that. But there's something really important there. Like, it's about how to maximally love people according to the appropriate proportion.
Yes.
So, Dale and Joe, we actually should have fraternal love for one another.
Yeah.
But I shouldn't love you like my son. That'd be weird, right? Like, that would be odd. And if I loved you like a customer at McDonald's, that would be weird too. It'd be, so it's really about how to love. So I think in the political discourse and then the way in which the online words were going back and forth, it seemed like this doctrine was moved out of its original context,
right,
which was like how to be holy and just, and shifted into a new context in a way that probably illustrates why retrieving...
The teaching was needed in the first place.
Why it's in the first place, yeah. Well, I think it's illustrative of like retrieval, two different kinds of retrieval. One is just repeating it and smashing it into whatever you want, versus retrieving to reflect on what it might mean for us today. And I think, you know, in the interview with Vice President Vance, it was just kind of like, you're on the hot seat, you answer fast. I'm not really too, I think he answered okay. It was just kind of a hot seat question. But I think the discourse afterwards, as Dale brought up, someone at his school was
it's not about Vance, right?
Why are we racist? Well, is the Ordo Amoris racist, or is it the most common, one of the most common and basic Christian teachings ever? And the answer is the second. Interesting enough, if you're an evangelical, you already know this. Every single evangelical marriage book or seminar says, you need to prioritize your wife over your children because your marriage will last by the time they go to the house. And they talk in that voice too. That's Ordo Amoris.
Or the Sunday school
wrong,
joy. Were you ever in the Sunday school where they said joy and it was like Jesus, others, yourself, or something like that? That's the priority.
Sure. I haven't been.
No, I was raised in deep Eva, brother, and like that.
Yes.
So
you're deeper than me,
But it's very simple Ordo Amoris for the kids, right?
Sure.
That's all.
Sure.
That's all it is.
And one thing you were saying, Wyatt, that I think this idea of proportion, given what the object is that is summoning forth our affection to it, is key. So and this is probably where wisdom is needed the most. We have to recognize that things have a nature and they have an end, they have a telos. And we should respect a thing as it is, for what it is, and then appreciate its telos. Now, things could have various ends, right, or uses. Take a cow. You could have a cow that's for milk, and you could have a cow that's for meat, or you could have a bull that's for breeding, or you could have a cow for, show cow or whatever. But let's just say I'm raising meat cows, and the end for them is to supply sustenance to my family. My relationship to that cow should be with a recognition towards its end, given its nature. So this is an animal. This is higher than the plants, but lower than the humans. And so there's a certain amount of care that I need to give to this animal, just given the nature of what it is. And if I take care of this animal well, and I make sure it doesn't have any infections or diseases, and it's eating the right kinds of foods, then the meat that I will get from this cow will be healthier for me, right? And so treating things in proper proportion to the nature and the telos of whatever is summoning forth your affection is where what wisdom and judgment comes in. And I think that one of the reasons maybe that we struggle with this in the modern world is because we don't really have to treat things well according to natures, because natures are largely hidden behind, just to keep with the cow example, hidden behind an assembly line and millions of faceless workers that just grow cows like corn and slaughter them, and high production, high efficiency. So I'm kind of like removed from my ability to love that cow in the way that I ought to love the cow. However, when I get the steak in front of me, I can say this is for an end. This is for nutrition. And so in order to appreciate it, and this goes back, like we used to, and you see this with hunters, like when hunters kill their prey, it's this very, very like solemn spiritual thing that good hunters do. They get over the buck after they've hit it with the bow, and their adrenaline's cranking, and they thank the buck. They're like, thank you for your life. There's this relationship that we have with things according to the reason that according to how we perceive their value to us. So like I can take a steak and I can prepare it in a way that properly signals my appreciation in proportion to what the thing is for that steak. So now I just don't like throw a steak in the microwave. I salt it, I rest it, I grill it, and I flip it right, and I bring it to the perfect temperature. I let it rest, I cut it, I serve it with other things. So it's not just merely about like moral duties, even though that's the biggest part that we think of when we talk about the Ordo Amoris. It's actually about how to maximize living well in creation. It's like have a meaningful life, and do things well. And when you do that, you're happier, actually. And it's like, go figure. If I treat alcohol with a healthy love, a healthy respect, I'm going to have a better life in my relationship with alcohol than an alcoholic or a teetotaler whose scrupulosity just eats away at their conscience whenever they see alcohol or whatever.
And
so
this is where the horizontal dimension, another thing that happens in the recent conversation, is that we're focusing very easily on a very thin sliver of even the horizontal dimension of the Ordo Amoris, whereas like I think what you just said is right, and like the ecological, and like I know people can get all worried. I promise everybody we're not Marxists. Everything's okay here. There's no like a poster of Lenin on the wall anywhere at the Davin, not that I know of. In any case. The ecological, or just like the treatment of animal significance of this, which I think conservatives in the last generation have gotten on board with through folks like Joel Salatin or something like that. And so even like just the sense that like, yeah, it feels right that if I'm eating a chicken, that the chicken had a good chicken life. Or if I'm eating beef, that the cow had a good cow life. There's something crass. There's something off in the Ordo Amoris, in the proper love. Loving something too little, which ought to be loved well, that even if I eat chicken, even if I eat beef, the sense is nevertheless that there's a weird kind of love bond, and there's the historical sense of that, and exactly what you said about hunting, right? The historical sense is that it's not a trivial thing to take a life,
Right.
even if it's not a rational animal. It's an animal. It's a conscious animal, and that matters. And there's a spiritual significance to it, and you're kind of raising the animal up by making it your nutrition, and yet. Probably in the technological world, I think it would be easy for us at least to say, whether you're coming from a progressive or a quite, local conservative perspective, our relationship to ecology, our relationship to animal life, our relationship even to something like meat eating is probably very instrumentalizing. It's just, I can have meat as often as I want. And I love meat. Believe me, I'm never going to be anti-meat. In a lot of cultures, though, it's kind of interesting that it's like meat is sort of like your special thing. Like you have it twice a week or something like that. And I'm totally fine with having meat every day. I'm not trying to get scrupulous about it or something like that. But again, if we're just even applying the Aristotelian mean, and we're not even getting at precision yet, as a culture, as a civilization, we're probably the sorts that consume animals and consume the environment in some ways without much reflection and question of how much should I love this thing? Am I recognizing the spiritual significance of I'm living in a house with wood. I'm totally for cutting down trees. I'm totally for eating animals. And yet those are significant acts. And there's an order of love that comes even into the consideration of those acts. And that's where philosophers, I've already mentioned them today, but philosophers like Stephen R. Clark, who nobody could call a super progressive, writes really reflectively on the human relationship to the natural resources and to the animal world.
Another philosopher who does that really well is Joseph Rogan. He has a podcast.
Yes.
Joseph,
yeah, exactly.
Rogan.
No, for real.
Okay, he's
so Joe Rogan really
agree in the philosophical world.
He does talk about animal health.
Yes. No, you're right. I was just affirming. He has like a deep respect for. He's a hunter, avid bow hunter, and he has a very, very deep respect for animals. And if you just follow him on his normal, if you never watched his YouTube and you followed him on Twitter or whatever, he's constantly posting about it. So yeah, it's intuitive almost to somebody that's connected.
Everyone to know that they watched Joe Rogan. I didn't even know this, but that's 4 points against. But the Davenant Institute is balanced, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes. Well, yeah. Go ahead, Wyatt. Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, I wrote down 5 notes from what you two said. One, I'll say them really quickly. I thought they were really helpful, then I'll let you go and say profound things. So there's a disconnect from food to plate. So, we don't even think about where the steak or hamburger comes from. Like my kids, if we have spaghetti, they're not thinking about the hamburger as a cow. It's spaghetti with the sauce. It's really important. So I think that's why someone like a Joe Rogan or a Stephen Clark, peers in terms of philosophical prowess.
Philosophical peers, no doubt.
see a deep connection between food and, its treatment and so on. I think that's really helpful. Having a good cow life, there's something intuitive. All of us, if you see like pigs or chickens mistreated, pigeonholed in a little box until they die, we feel like there's something wrong with that. Even if you're hard-hearted, the moment you see that, you're like, there's just something wrong here.
Right.
But I wanted to go back, so that was recent, to what Dale said. So you said things have a nature, and they have a telos. And then I added, we need to love things for what they are and their uses. So things have a nature. I think that's a really important point. So it sounds so straightforward, but a tree has a nature, a pig has a nature, a Dale has a nature. And to love something appropriately, according to the proportion that you ought to love it, you actually need to know what the thing is. So if you're like, I love money for money's sake, it's not clear that you know what money is for.
Yeah, that's right.
So even though it either sounds obvious or too abstract, just knowing what stuff is produces freedom. Because if you can define a thing itself, then you know exactly what to do with said thing. How to enjoy it, how not to enjoy it, and how to avoid ruin.
Yeah, and our good brother Brad Littlejohn, in his little chapter in the Reform or Classical Education book, his whole thesis is like education is just naming things, and that's what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be able to say what a thing is, and that requires that you know it. And if I moved it back to like first principles, I would say like the fact of something requires your attention to apprehend its very existence. So the fact that there's a tree in my front yard, and it could not be there, but it is there, and that's a form of life, and it's standing above the abyss of nothing. It's shining out of above the abyss of nothing into my awareness. That in itself requires my attention and my recognition and my appreciation. And so what all we're getting to is like eventually like we're literally talking about love. So when I love you two men because I see that you're here. Not only you here, but I love that you're here. I appreciate that I know Wyatt and Joe. And another step further than that is like, and I'm going to do what I can within my power to help your life flourish. And this is all we're talking about is like the ordering of love. The love is the word that I think needs to be spoken about more. Because for me to love something in various ways, if we went with the way that Lewis kind of chops it up in the four loves, I think all of that is appropriate. But what's at the bottom of all of that is an appreciation for that which is. And so if I can, and I also think the automobile messed us up in like appreciating trees, for example. But if I can like slow down and think about the fact that it is deeply, 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 deeply profound that that tree is right there, because the odds of that tree being right there at this point in history is almost impossible. It's like 1 in a gazillion chance that that tree, that I got to see that tree at this little scratch in history in its current form. It's going to be dead in whatever, 100 years, maybe. And so like, that requires me to appreciate it just because it's there, and then to do something that at least doesn't kill it, at least doesn't take away its life. And if I do take away its life, then it's like I use it for the flourishing of higher life forms. But everything revolves around a deep appreciation for the fact of things. And this is what I think, like, especially when we start to, well, I don't know if I want to go there. So let me wrap up this thought by just saying this. This is why war and genocide and disease and natural evil like hurricanes and tsunamis, this is why it catches all of our attention, because something goes very wrong that we know shouldn't go wrong. And this is why fundamentally Christianity is the only proper understanding of reality that can help us answer the questions of evil, but in light of our appreciation of life.
To apply that to the, oh, sorry.
Last sentence, because like the Son of God literally died. He gave himself up for our eternal life. That is the thing that I think needs to be central when we talk about the ordering. What are we ordering? Love. We're ordering love.
And so, the distinction, when we talk about the proper ordering of the affections, one of the we were talking about loving animals too little, loving ecology too little, and one of the things that happens, you were talking about natures. We have to see natures, and you see values, a hierarchy of value in a sense, more valuable, in one sense, more valuable creatures than other valuable creatures. And one of the reasons you love Wyatt and I is because what shines above the abyss of nothing in a person is something more than a what. I think the philosophers rightly say that to answer what is a person is almost a contradiction in terms a little bit. Who is a person? There's a particularizing effect. There's a common human nature that we share but the human nature is always particularized in its combination with matter and in the spiritual aspect of our soul, if you want to play it all out philosophically. But there's human nature, that's the what that we are. But to say Dale, Joe, and Wyatt is to go a step further and say, who are you? And animals and trees shares to some degree in that particularization, but when that particularization is inflected through rational animality and a spiritual soul, you have this superlative sense of particularity.
Yes.
And then, of course, Christ is the fullness of man and the fullness of personage, in a sense, inflected in a created key, which is why he's such a compelling person within the history of man. But it's a relevant statement for a reflection on the Ordo Amoris, because there's a sense in which, think about everything we just said about animals, and it stirs our souls, and it should. But then when you move to persons, to the who, then you've gone a transcendental step up, as it were, and the Ordo Amoris at that level it takes on this kind of deeper hue, and I think those things are connected.
Well, it's kind of alluding to what Dale said when Jesus says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." He is instituting an order to love. He is saying there is a greater form of love than another form, namely the self-sacrificial love of laying down his life for his friends. And in particular, he's alluding to his passion, where he lays down his life for his disciples, for us, for those who become his friends by faith. And there's just something so basic to that the love of God has been demonstrated to us through the incarnation. Athanasius, in his book on the incarnation, defines the sort of primary attribute of God, both I think for creation and incarnation, as philanthropy, namely a love of mankind. And this seems to be like the baseline for who God is. I mean, John himself, 1 John 4:8-16, defines God as love. And I think you do that because you see what God does, and you can trace his activities back to his power, that is the capacity for power in the sense of, anyways, the power of love. And I think that's just so important, that that's the God who is and the Christ who came, so that we are the Christians who do. And when I've seen this doctrine bandied about over the last 2 weeks, it's almost ironic or perverse that it's often about exclusionary things,
Right.
rather than the sort of universal scope of Christ's death for the cosmos. And it doesn't have the ring of transformational quality like Augustine talks, a holy and just man. But it almost has the ring of sort of justifying one's, let's say, xenophobia, which is just, whether you agree with Pope Francis or not on the Good Samaritan story, I'm not sure I buy everything he says.
Right.
When you ask, well, who is my neighbor? Like, who should I treat well? You're asking the question in the place of the bad guy of the story. Like,
Right.
It's like the meme, maybe we're the bad guys.
Right.
So,
well, it's interesting. Yes. So to kind of pull everything that we've been talking about. So like, yes, exactly. Like the human shining creature is at the top. The only thing above it is God. But humanity, rational creatures, those creatures are the creatures that we have the greatest responsibility to recognize their nature, their human nature, and to treat them in proper proportion according to their fact of being. And here's where I think I really think that this is where the devil gets into it. Like we see this all throughout the scriptures. You call that which is evil good, and that which is good evil. This inversion happens to where you could take a doctrine like the order of loves, the ordering of the affections, and actually use it to denigrate, to make the human creature something less. Now, I know that there are, within the Christian tradition, we talk about sort of sinners that stay in their sin and don't repent of their sin, kind of devolving to a lesser form than their full humanity, right? They become like orcs or whatever. They become Gollum. So that's what sin does, because sin inverts love back to self, and therefore shuts others out, and is unconcerned about others. But I think, and I'm just saying this because I know my own heart, I have the tendency to always use something like this to invert everything back into myself, and therefore miss the actual ordering of my affections and how it ought to be played out in my life. And that's where things can be so very dangerous. So
I
in the
remember you
modern,
telling a story about that with your visit to Costa Rica. Uh,
yes,
I
yes.
mean, yeah.
Well, real quick, yes. We were on a mountain. I don't know, 1,000 feet from the beach, from the ocean, and we would wake up every morning. The howler monkeys would be screaming. It's like, just like insane. And howler monkeys don't sound like that. They sound like demons, actually. They're like, it's like, but they're not very intimidating to look at. But when I would wake up in the morning and I'd be drinking my coffee on the pool, near the pool, I would be looking for all the animal noises, and I would get ticked off that the people down the mountain from me were laughing and having a good time because their voices were polluting my experience of nature. Like, how come you can't shut up and let me enjoy my serenity? And it was like this like immediate thought, like, you just said that those voices, the voices of human creatures, is somehow less desirable than a howler monkey. And it was like this pivotal moment in my life where I'm like, do I actually like people? There's sometimes where I don't like people. When I drive, our good friend Nathan Johnson, I sent him a text message one day because there was just a comedy of errors about my day. I was running a bunch of, I was going to the post office, had to go shopping, had to return a piece of clothing or whatever, had to get gas. So I'm driving around town, and it's like nobody knows how to drive. And I sent Nathan a message, and I'm like, dude, I am so annoyed and aggravated at just humanity in general. And Nathan responded was like to me, and he's like, oh, that's just because you need to repent. And I was like, he's like, you need to be patient, and you need to be kind, and you need to, view those other people as, your fellow brethren on the pilgrimage. And it's like, oh, and it's correct. So I guess the only point that I wanted to make here is like, whatever we do with this doctrine, may it never be said of us that we use it as a means by which we demean and diminish the shining human creature from their rightful station. And may God help us to appreciate and labor for all of humanity, beginning with those closest to us. Yeah.
I don't know that I need to say anything more after that. I think we've ordered the Amoris quite well, and I think we can give you the final word. How does that sound?
Amen.
Yeah, that sounds good. I love you guys.
Love you too.
Love you too. Stopping now. Done, I think. Right, yes.
Beautiful.